A sharp scream shattered the rainy silence of Manhattan that night. "What the hell are you doing?" Rachel Linwood shouted, scrambling to pull a thin jacket over herself as the back door of her SUV suddenly swung open. She had just finished a difficult therapy session with one of her young patients, and with the rain pouring down unexpectedly, she had ducked into her car to change out of her soaked clothes before heading to a charity event. The man at the door froze, stunned. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, he still had his hand on the door handle, unable to speak. His eyes instinctively scanned Rachel's figure before realizing the impropriety and quickly turning away. "I thought this was my Uber," he stammered, something Daniel Whitaker, millionaire tech entrepreneur, had never done in his life. Stammer. Rachel's face flushed with both fury and embarrassment as she pulled her jacket tightly around her. "It clearly isn't. Shut the door and get out," she yelled, nearly hysterical. Daniel stepped back, hands raised in surrender, but just then, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street. A police officer approached and knocked on the window. "Is there a problem here?" The officer glanced into the car, a half-dressed woman, a well-dressed man, both tense and soaked. His face shifted from concern to suspicion. "I'm going to need both of you to come with me to the station for clarification." "This isn't what it looks like." Daniel tried to regain his usual composed tone. "Please let me get dressed," Rachel murmured, visibly mortified. The officer didn't budge. 10 minutes later, they were escorted to the precinct, Daniel silent in the back of the patrol car, Rachel dressing herself as quickly as possible in tense silence. Sitting across from the officer, Rachel told her side. She was changing out of wet clothes before attending a crucial event for the nonprofit she managed. Daniel, for his part, had simply mistaken the SUV for his rideshare, dazed after a long day of meetings. 3 hours later, with IDs verified and statements corroborated, they were released. No charges. As they waited outside under a flickering street lamp, Daniel turned to her. He truly apologized for the misunderstanding. Rachel looked directly at him under the dim light, his amber eyes steady but not arrogant. She nodded and replied softly, "No one's at fault. It's just, I'm getting married soon, and my fiancé isn't exactly the kind of man who'd laugh this off." Daniel nodded, though something inside him dipped slightly at the word fiancé. "Of course. Let's pretend we never met." "Exactly." Rachel extended her hand like a formal agreement. When their palms touched, something strange flickered between them, an unexpected heat, but both ignored it. "Goodbye." They turned away, each convinced this would be the last they'd ever see of the other, unaware that this night had just rewritten the course of their carefully managed lives. Rachel stepped into the penthouse apartment she shared with her fiancé, Ethan Clark, and immediately sensed a strange chill in the air. It wasn't the temperature, it was something less tangible, harder to name. Ethan was on the sofa, laptop open, fingers flying over the keys. "You're back?" he asked, eyes still fixed on the screen. "Yeah, and I need to tell you something." Rachel hung her coat, poured herself a glass of water, and sat down. She recounted the entire event, how the rain had forced her to change in the car, how a man had mistaken it for his Uber, how the police had gotten involved, and how mortifying the whole ordeal had been. She didn't leave anything out. Honesty had always been her cornerstone. Ethan paused typing and finally looked up, his face unreadable. And who was this guy? Daniel Whitaker. Daniel Whitaker? His brow lifted slightly. The founder of Whitaker Systems? Rachel nodded. Ethan chuckled, not from amusement, but from intrigue. "Well, that's certainly unexpected. But it might be useful." Rachel blinked. "Useful?" "I'm not talking about the part where he saw you half-naked," Ethan clarified. "I mean, you're managing a major charity project, and Daniel has influence. I've been trying to connect with his foundation since last year." "You're thinking about work?" Rachel asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. "We both want the same things, don't we?" Ethan replied, taking a sip of his wine. "Careers, influence, a solid network. That's what a successful life is built on." Rachel was quiet. A wave of disappointment washed over her like a slow, rising tide. She'd expected concern, maybe even a bit of jealousy. Anything to show that he cared, not just about her role in his vision for the future. "You're not upset?" she asked softly. "Why would I be?" Ethan shrugged. "You didn't do anything wrong." At that moment, Rachel felt an invisible wall between them, a divide she hadn't noticed before. It felt like she was sharing her life with a business partner, not someone she was about to marry. That night, lying next to Ethan in a wide, perfectly made bed, Rachel stared at the ceiling. Her mind wandered, again and again, back to the amber eyes of the stranger who had stood at her car door. There had been something disarming in the way he looked at her, honest, unfiltered, and impossible to forget. She couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. That was the strangest part. Night after night, no matter how hard she tried to move on, the image of that man, Daniel Whitaker, kept replaying in Rachel's mind. Not because of the embarrassment, but because of his gaze, calm, direct, and entirely without claim. Rachel stood before the mirror, adjusting the elegant black dress she had chosen for tonight's gala. It was the annual fundraising event for HopeBridge, the rehabilitation-focused nonprofit she had been managing for the past 3 years. The event had to go perfectly. Every detail had been arranged meticulously. White orchid centerpieces, a chamber orchestra, a refined vegan menu, and an impressive guest list of influential donors and business leaders. As she entered the hotel's grand ballroom, Rachel wore her practiced smile, greeting guests and giving final checks with her team. But her heart skipped a beat when she saw him, tall, in a tuxedo, standing among a group of Eastside Foundation directors, Daniel Whitaker. She froze for a split second, then steadied her breath and walked forward as if nothing had changed. "Rachel, someone important wants to meet you," her assistant whispered, subtly guiding her toward the group. "Daniel, may I introduce you to Rachel Linwood, our lead coordinator for the HopeBridge Center." Daniel turned. Those amber eyes were just as she remembered them, but now framed with a perfectly neutral smile. "A pleasure to meet you, Ms. Linwood," he said, offering his hand. "The pleasure's mine, Mr. Whitaker." Rachel took it lightly. A spark passed through her fingertips, subtle but undeniable. They both pretended to be strangers. For the next hour, they exchanged pleasantries, mingled with other guests, and avoided looking directly at each other when others were near. But whenever the room's attention shifted, their eyes would quietly find each other again. As the foundation's director stepped onto the stage, Rachel slipped away to prepare her speech, but a familiar voice stopped her mid-step. "Didn't expect to see you here," Daniel murmured, eyes still on the stage. "I've worked with this foundation for 3 years," she replied, keeping her voice low. "Strange, I don't recall seeing you at past events." "Maybe because you were never personally invited," Rachel said, frowning. Daniel smirked. "This time, I was. Your fiancé reached out, rather insistently." Rachel stiffened. Ethan had orchestrated this? After everything, she suddenly felt like a pawn in someone else's game. Before she could reply, her name was called. Rachel stepped up to the podium, spotlights blinding, her pulse racing. She spoke about the Rehabilitation Center, a place of new beginnings for children recovering from traumatic injuries. Her voice was steady, but every time she glanced out, Daniel's eyes were there, unmoving. She ended with your support, these children will have the future they deserve." Applause erupted. Then came the surprise. Daniel stood up. "On behalf of the Whitaker Foundation, I'd like to commit to funding 50% of the project's total cost," he announced clearly, calmly. A wave of shock swept through the room. Rachel stood frozen, trying to maintain composure. The director nearly danced with joy. "A historic moment! We must capture this! Daniel and Rachel, please join me for a photo." They stood close as cameras flashed. Daniel leaned in, whispering so only she could hear. "But there's one condition." Rachel's fingers tightened around her bouquet. "You'll oversee the project personally, weekly reports directly to me." "Why me?" she muttered. "Because you're the only one I trust to keep it honest." She should have said no. Rachel should have shut it down right there at the gala, thanked him politely, handed the project over to someone else. But when the night ended and she returned home to find Ethan waiting with a glass of wine and a question about successful sponsorship, she simply said, "He asked me to oversee it personally. I agreed." Ethan smiled with approval. "Good. I figured he was impressed." Impressed? No. Daniel Whitaker didn't operate on flattery. And Rachel wasn't sure what had kept her from refusing. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe something she wasn't ready to name. 3 days later, Rachel stepped into Daniel's office on the top floor of a glass-walled tower in the financial district. It was open, modern, minimal, but the view was what overwhelmed her. New York City stretched endlessly below, silent and small. Daniel stood from behind a dark wood desk as she entered. "Ms. Rachel Linwood," he said. No smile, but something flickered in his eyes. "I've been waiting." "The revised plans follow the suggestions from the architecture team," Rachel said, lifting her tablet with professional ease. They reviewed the updated layout for the rehab center. Rachel leaned over the table, pointing to the hydrotherapy section. Daniel stepped beside her silently. When she turned slightly, the distance between them vanished. She could feel his breath near her neck, sandalwood, and something cool like mint. "My recommendation is to expand the aquatic therapy area," she said, voice steady. "Agreed," he replied, not moving. Rachel pulled away and walked to the conference table. "I'll forward the suggestion. Weekly reports every Monday, per your request." "Perfect," he nodded. But his gaze lingered longer than necessary. The following meetings were the same. Efficient, structured, on schedule, but within the charts and construction reports were moments that moved more slowly. Once, while she reviewed procurement lists, Daniel placed a black coffee next to her elbow. She hadn't told him her order. He just said, "I noticed during the gala, you skipped the cappuccino." Another time, when they visited the construction site, rain caught them by surprise. They stood under a corrugated awning, shoulders brushing, saying nothing. Rachel knew this was dangerous. She was still recovering from Ethan. Not just the betrayal, but the realization of all the things he had never been. Yet with Daniel, she felt seen. Not as a strategic match, but as a human. Flawed and questioning. One late afternoon, after a meeting ran long, Daniel offered her coffee in the downstairs lounge. She should have declined, but she sat across from him anyway, in the quiet space of the building's cafe. "You were engaged?" Daniel asked, tone casual but probing. "I was," Rachel answered, fingers circling the rim of the porcelain cup. "I called it off." "Because of me?" he asked, without flinching. Rachel met his gaze. "No, not exactly, but maybe you helped me realize how much I had sacrificed in the name of safety." Daniel leaned back. "I understand. I've chosen control over connection most of my life. And now here you are having coffee with a non-profit project manager," she smiled. He chuckled, low and brief. "I'm not sure this is still about the project." Silence, soft but heavy. "Daniel," she said after a moment, "I'm not sure I'm ready." "I'm not asking for anything," he said, eyes steady. "I just want to be closer. If you'll let me." That night, when Rachel returned to the apartment, now hers alone, she stood for a long time, staring at the city through the glass. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of being alone. She still hadn't said the words out loud. Her connection with Daniel was growing in ways Rachel couldn't have predicted. Slow yet intense, terrifying yet magnetic. But deep down, she knew there was one door left partially open. Ethan. The wedding had been called off, but they had never officially spoken since. Ethan kept texting like nothing had really changed, asking how she was, suggesting coffee, occasionally sending long, self-reflective updates. Rachel read them, but never replied. Then, one Friday afternoon, her phone rang, an unknown number. "Rachel Linwood," a female voice asked. "This is Leah, Mr. Daniel Whitaker's assistant. I believe you should see something." An hour later, Rachel sat across from Daniel in his office. On the desk lay a thick folder of color-printed pages, roughly 30 in total. Inside were photographs of Ethan dining with a brunette woman, holding hands across the table. Another showed him kissing her cheek goodbye. "How did you get these?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice level. "My assistant happened to spot them at a midtown restaurant," Daniel explained. "She recognized Ethan from a previous gala. I didn't have anyone follow him, I just thought you should know." Rachel didn't respond right away. She turned the pages slowly, like flipping through a medical report. Concrete evidence of something she had long suspected, but hadn't dared face. "What do you want out of this?" she asked finally, looking up with a mix of anger and pain. Daniel held her gaze. "Maybe. I just couldn't bear to see you continue choosing someone who doesn't deserve you." For a moment, Rachel forgot how to breathe. She stood, grabbed the folder, and left the room without another word. Ethan agreed to meet her the next morning at a familiar cafe, the same place they had once planned the wedding menu. He arrived on time, impeccably dressed, the same image of the successful attorney she had once admired. Rachel laid the folder on the table in front of him. Ethan opened it, looked through the images in silence. He didn't panic. He didn't deny. "She's a client," he said, as if that explained everything. "You kiss your clients?" Rachel asked, voice steady but laced with quiet disappointment. "Rachel," Ethan sighed, "you understand. In my world, and once in yours too, image, relationships, even intimacy, they're all strategy." "Strategy?" she repeated, almost laughing. "You think relationships are games to be played?" "Not games, constructs," Ethan said, as if explaining simple logic. "I thought you got that. Our marriage? It would have been a strong partnership. You bring social value, I bring professional clout. Together, we could have gone far." Rachel closed her eyes for a few seconds. When she opened them, the truth inside her had settled. "You don't love me," she said quietly. Ethan paused. Then, with a trace of genuine regret, answered, "I think, in my own way, I once did." She stood. "I used to think I loved you too, but maybe I just loved the feeling of being safe." As Rachel stepped out of the cafe, it wasn't raining, but the wind was sharp, biting against her skin like the reality she could no longer avoid. There would be no soft landing, no perfect farewell. But for the first time, she wasn't walking away out of fear. She walked away because she knew she no longer belonged there. She needed space, but hadn't expected to find clarity with it. After seeing Ethan, Rachel felt like she had just walked out of a long-term contract she'd never fully read. Her mind was blank, not sad, not angry, just still. 3 days later, she drove up the coast to the small town in Maine where the organization was supervising a community pilot project. She told her team she needed a few quiet days to revise the media strategy. But deep down, she knew she needed to escape it all. When her car pulled up to the hilltop guest house where she'd stayed last year, dusk had just begun to settle. She didn't unpack, just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the distant heaving sea. Cold, but honest. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, not Daniel, not her coworkers, not Ethan. So when the wooden door creaked open that Wednesday afternoon and Daniel stood on the porch, sleeves rolled, dark jeans, hair tousled from the salt wind, her heart stopped for half a beat. "You shouldn't be here," Rachel said, not angry, just off balance. "I know," Daniel nodded, "but I needed to make sure you were okay." "How did you know I was here?" "Leah told me you canceled all your meetings this week. I guessed, and I was right." Rachel leaned against the doorframe. "You're good at guessing." Daniel didn't step inside. He stood there quietly for a moment, then said, more softly, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I don't want to go back to what I had, where everything made sense and nothing felt real." She looked at him, for the first time not guarded. He looked different, less polished, less assured, but more human than ever. "I was terrified," Rachel admitted, calling off the wedding. "I thought I'd lose direction, that I'd fall apart, but I don't regret it." Daniel stepped up one stair, but stayed at a respectful distance. As for me, he said, I'm scared of this feeling, of missing someone I've barely known, outside of a few conversations and glances. He met her eyes. I'm falling in love with you, Rachel. Slowly, uncertainly, but it's real. She felt something fracture inside, like hearing a sentence she didn't know she'd been waiting for. She stepped back slightly, whispered, I can't promise anything right now. I'm still learning how to live honestly. But, Daniel moved forward, gently taking her hand. You don't need to promise. Just, don't shut me out. She didn't. Not this time. She hadn't pushed him away, but that didn't mean everything got easier. After that afternoon in Maine, Daniel returned to the city. Rachel stayed a few extra days to clear her mind. They texted daily, not intensely, not expectantly, just a steady, quiet presence. For the first time in her life, she felt a relationship not based on need, but on choice. One morning, upon returning to her office, Rachel found an email from an international address. It was an official offer from a global health organization in Barcelona, inviting her to lead a European pediatric rehabilitation program. She had applied nearly a year ago and forgotten. Holding the printed letter, she sat in silence. This was her professional dream, to lead something global, meaningful, to have real impact, to be heard. But now, with the dream within reach, her emotions weren't simple. Something tugged at her from deep within, a quiet echo from a windswept porch. Daniel's eyes, his hands gently holding hers, his confession under the salt breeze. She didn't tell him right away. She needed time. 3 days later, they met again in Daniel's office. He was reviewing a new project plan when she placed an envelope on his desk. What's this? Daniel asked, but his eyes held a flicker of unease. I've been offered a position in Barcelona, executive director, 3-year program. He didn't speak for a few seconds, then put his pen down. Will you take it? Rachel met his eyes, this time unflinching. I don't know. You didn't tell me because you thought I'd say no, he asked quietly. No, she said, shaking her head. I was afraid of disappointing you, or, worse, hurting myself. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I knew. You were on the finalist list. I'm on the funding committee, but I didn't know how to bring it up. Her eyes widened. You knew and said nothing? I was afraid if I did, you'd feel manipulated, or you'd reject it just to avoid me. I misjudged. The silence between them was heavy. But this time, no one left. That night, Rachel sat alone on her balcony, laptop open, reviewing the proposal again. When she reached the final email, she opened the attachment. Proposed hybrid leadership model, Barcelona/New York, 6-month rotational. Author, Rachel Linwood. The idea had struck her earlier that afternoon, and now she would send it. A chance not to choose between love and purpose, but to choose both on her own terms. She had sent the proposal, but what came next, no one could predict. A week later, Rachel received a reply from the organization in Barcelona. They were impressed with the rotating model she had suggested. They requested one final meeting with a representative from the Whitaker Foundation, and that, of course, meant Daniel. The meeting was scheduled at Daniel's office, in a glass-walled room overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Rachel arrived early. For the first time in weeks, she dressed like a specialist again. Navy dress, hair tied back, eyes steady. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, carrying 2 coffees. For you, he said, placing it exactly where she usually set her laptop. Thanks, she replied softly, not because she was nervous, but because she knew today wasn't just about business. The international representative appeared on screen. The conversation flowed smoothly. Rachel presented the 6-month rotation model, Barcelona and New York, ensuring project continuity and shared impact. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't steer. When it was his turn to speak, he simply said, I believe we need leaders who break old structures to build something truly lasting. The Whitaker Foundation supports this plan. with one condition. Ms. Linwood leads it. The representative smiled. We wouldn't want anyone else. When the meeting ended, Rachel gathered her papers. Daniel remained standing, his expression soft. Congratulations, he said. Looks like you'll have 2 cities to call home. She looked at him, then stepped closer. I don't know what will happen. We may change, or we may not. But if you'll walk beside me, not to lead, just to be there, then I'm ready. Daniel nodded, stepping forward, fingers brushing lightly against her wrist. I don't need control anymore. I just need trust. And for the first time they kissed, not out of confusion, not from emotional collapse, but because they had both chosen to stay rather than run. That kiss wasn't like any before. It wasn't a promise or a chain. It was a door opening for them both to step through. A month had passed since that defining meeting. Rachel had officially accepted the executive director role for the European program. These days, she spent most of her time finalizing transition plans with her New York team while engaging in daily calls with the Barcelona partners. Everything moved like a new gear slotting into place, and this time, she was the one turning it. Daniel didn't interfere. He didn't manage her schedule, didn't try to make decisions for her. Instead, he simply showed up. When she needed him, when she didn't know she did, when she looked back and found him standing right there. They didn't move in together. No announcements were made, but in the way he looked at her, in their dinners, in the way he would lightly place his hand on the small of her back when they crossed the street, Rachel knew this was the most honest thing she'd ever had. One crisp autumn morning, Rachel sat in her temporary apartment, packing for her flight. On the table lay an old box, inside the wedding invitation that had never been sent. This time, she lifted it without hesitation, opened it, and read the gold-embossed line, Rachel Linwood and Ethan Clark, a celebration of union. She smiled, not with sadness, not with regret, just a quiet smile, like reading a letter you once wrote to a younger version of yourself and realizing how much you've grown. She dropped the invitation into the trash and closed the lid. That evening, she met Daniel at a quiet bistro by the park. Wooden tables bathed in soft amber light. They sat close, speaking little. Sometimes, silence was the only language that mattered. I leave tomorrow, she said, as dessert arrived. I know, Daniel replied, his eyes fixed on the candle between them. I'll be back in March, then gone again 6 months later, she exhaled, more to affirm it to herself. I'll be here, he nodded, and when you return, I'll be at the airport. Rachel laughed gently and reached for his hand. I don't need the airport. I just need to know you won't disappear. Daniel reached up and touched her cheek, eyes unguarded, for the first time holding something raw. Hope, softness, and trust. The next morning, as the plane lifted from JFK, Rachel leaned her head against the window, watching the city shrink beneath her. She didn't cry. She wasn't afraid. She only felt peaceful, as if, at last, she had learned how to begin again without needing all the answers.